I will not talk about silver. I will not talk about money. I will not talk about banks, and I will not talk about debt. What I will talk about is coal and coke. And I'll talk about a little bit about technology transfer, and innovation. Um, and the reason why I'm talking about coke, and this is, I'm sorry to say, it's not the fun part of coke. It's the boring coke, and the carbon coke. The reason why I like talking about it is it helps me evade an important debate. So I'm a historian of Japan. My new project, which is the very much in progress, hence like Vladimir's project, it's pretty much in gestational phase. It's my postdoctoral one. There's this huge debate, especially also in China, on what is modern, what is early modern. So when you talk about modern mining, what exactly do you mean? Well, in the 1980s, what we meant by mining and innovation in mining was the word modernization. We don't use that now. We talk about innovation, but it really meant buying machines and machinery for coal mines. And then, of course, our colleagues, Chinese historians, especially those Sung historians, said, well, wait a minute. If you're really talking about that modernity means the increase of scale of mining, then you really do have a problem, because between 19th and 11th century in China, there was a six-fold increase in output of pig iron, which is the best way to estimate coal output. Really, and it was just half as much as we do in 1919. So, you know, if you're talking about coal mining in 1919, how much modern do you really talk about? Plus, all the technologies that you use in the 19th century and the 20th century in mining in China have already existed in the 11th century. So, again, what are you talking when you're talking about modern mining? And the reason why I like coke is because coke is one of those exceptions. Coke is one of those, perhaps two exceptions in coal mining techniques. Coke in blast furnaces, that when you talk about it, no one's really asking you whether you're what do you really mean by modern mining technology. So that's why I like talking about coke. But let me give you a brief note on coal in Northeast Asia, and especially in Japan. We know in Japan we start really talking about coal in the 18th century. And the reason why is because we burned all the wood. Especially we burned all the pine needles that we need to produce salt. So at the beginning of the 18th century, we started having commercial dealers of coal, which are very, very focused in the northern Kyushu area and the Inland Sea, and around the Inland Sea, which is the center of salt production. And this goes fairly well in fairly stable in the 18th century, but it's on a very small scale. And to give you an example, we're talking about the estimated in 1780. We're talking about 40 to 50 tons of coal per year. So that's not huge. What changes at the beginning of the 19th century is that the expansion of the salt production piled together with and even less wood that we have, which brings us to actually start digging new mines. And by 1820, so which is basically a 40 period of time, we were tripling the production of coal. It's becoming increasingly cheaper, increasingly more important to dig coal, because coal is a cheaper way of producing salt than burning the little wood we have left that we need for other things as well. So that's one of the incentives. The salt industry is one important incentive in the beginning of the 19th century to push for production of coal. Another one is, and we talked about it today a bit, is the commercial treaties, and one of the things that we mentioned about Treaty of Kanagawa, but one of the important parts and one of the important reasons why Americans go and knock with their gunboat diplomacy on the door of Japan is not necessarily just to do the trade, but also to do recoaling. So that's a very, very important thing. Yes, we do the trade, but before that, we actually have to put some gas into our tanks. And this is another important push for Japan to start actually trying to exploit more and more of the coal it has. In addition to that, and this is on a slightly smaller scale, the shogunate, the Tokugawa government at the time, and later on the Meiji government, is really goes big on trying to build ships, because this is one of the major traumas of the late Tokugawa period, is seeing those big ships next to Japanese small ships, and then all of a sudden you have a shipping industry trying to shipping efforts, and then naval efforts also going, and that's one of the two important incentives in the 19th century. And the final one, and the one that I think connects this project to the project that George was talking about, is actually a political will or ideological will behind the exploration, which is, if you're talking about self-strengthening, which is the name of the game in the second half of the 19th century, both in China and Japan and elsewhere, you're talking about self-sufficiency. You're talking about we have to be able to have all we need in case, for example, we don't get enough coal from Britain, which never happened, but could have happened. So these are very important points, and the mid-century is an interesting point, because it is at this time when we see that all the upper beds of coal, so the coal that's easy to get to, have been exhausted. So as human beings at this point, we have two choices: we either dig further somewhere else, or we dig deeper. And this is where in coaling technology we see, for example, digging of special ventilation shafts. So previously we haven't dug unless we're digging to get something out. Now we're seeing special shafts that are just ventilation shafts that are being dug. And we also see certain efforts to, for example, use the hand pumps to pump the water out, because that's the perpetual story, or the perpetual problem of coal mining at this period is twofold: ventilation, so that you don't have gas explosions, and seepage of water. So you need to get the water out and some air in order to have a safe working environment. So that's briefly on coal. My topic today, what I really want to talk to you about is what happens to the coal once it's out. And this is where, as Professor Kudo was saying this morning, we have rupees, right? We have Indian rupees, silver rupees, but it's actually not the same thing, right? They're rupees and they're rupees. So with coal, it's a little bit similar. We have coal, and we say, but it's not really one thing. And we have several types of coal. And the reason why that is important is, especially in modern period, it becomes important because depending on what kind of coal you have, you can do or not do certain things. So for example, if you have anthracite, which is a very good quality coal with about only 10% of impurities, there are all kinds of things you can do. Unfortunately, most of the coal deposits in Japan are bituminous, which is so-called dirty coal or subbituminous coal, which has a very high percentage of impurities, up to sometimes 40%, a lot of sulfur. And with this kind of coal, it doesn't really matter much. For example, if you want to do cooking, doesn't matter. If you want to do electricity, it doesn't really matter. You can do that too. If you want to do some iron smelting, you can do that too. But where it becomes really, really crucial is when you want to have a modern steel industry. Now, if you want to have serious steel industry, and that you need for the railroad, for example, for ships, you absolutely need to have coke. Now, coke occurs occasionally in nature, but it's mostly a product, something that you actually have to make artificially, and it was very often done by piling. So you put coal, you pile stuff on it, and you burn it with as little air as possible, and you get a very compact thing. If this would work, so this is how it looks when you find it in the archives. This was my first encounter with with coal that was found in archival boxes. And in Europe, we're talking about coke ovens only in 19th century, which is basically just like a cooking oven, and in which you put coal. And we're talking about batteries of coke ovens, which look something like this. So there's a lineup of coking ovens. Now, the problem with coking ovens is twofold. One was that there's a lot of byproduct that comes out, and that was usually not recuperated in the second half of the 19th century, which means there is a lot of loss. The second problem, which is particularly important, is that you could, for Japan, was that you could only coke a certain kind of coal. Now, the first problem was resolved at the very end of the 19th century by introduction of something called byproduct coking ovens, which, by its name makes clear, were very good in the sense that they enabled recuperation of, for example, gas, coal tar, and a whole bunch of other derivatives. The second problem was not solved in Europe. Why? Because there was no need to solve it in Europe. Europeans, especially Belgians, had a lot of good quality coke. They didn't need to worry too much about it. And in Americans as well, they had a lot of Pennsylvania anthracite. They did not need to worry about that at all. And they were quite happy to export it to the Japanese or Chinese or anyone else who really, really wanted it. The problem for the Japanese at this point, and this is where Meiji spirit comes in, is that they want to make it themselves. They have steady supplies. They're not necessarily very, very worried about them, but they do want to make it on their own. They want to be able to do it themselves. That's the Meiji spirit. That's the self-reliance. That's the self-dependence story that's behind this. So the problem of the day is that you have a technology that you can import from Europe, but it's practically useless when you bring it home because you do not have the kind of coal that is made to work with. So how do you solve that problem? That problem in Japan was solved by this gentleman, the author of this book. This is actually my first encounter with this very interesting fellow who, and this is a collection of poems written originally in English by Shimura Kotaro, who was graduated with a BA in 1875. He graduated from a missionary university. Needless to say, he was a practicing Protestant. He went then to Worcester in Massachusetts, to a polytechnic, after which he went to get a PhD in chemistry from Johns Hopkins, and returned to Japan to teach in a Harris History of Science, Harris Department of School of Science at the Doshisha University, which is a private missionary university in Kyoto, which was the first private science school or science faculty in Japan. And this is something sort of a before and after. So this is before going to the States, and this is after coming to the States. So this is the fellow who solved this problem of how to coke uncokeable. Because this is in fact what he was being said. He would go and ask his colleagues, "Look, how do I do this?" And they would say, "Well, you don't. You import Cardiff coal, and we'll sell you the coke ovens, and you just do it in Japan if you really want to cut the cost." So either you can import coke itself. But he was saying, no, I really would like to try this. I really want to do this on my own. And unlike many stories in Japan which start with foreign advisors, this is one of the stories where Shimura put his foot down. Maybe he bluffed, maybe he was lucky, and he said, "If you bring an engineer from England, I will resign. I will not do this." And he was lucky, so they kind of let him go with it. In part because this was a minor affair. It was a company that was started. Today's Osaka Gas. It was a company that was started by an Osaka merchant with a little bit of support by Matsukata, and it was a little bit of a side affair. It was neither a military research and development. This is not the University of Tokyo research lab, which is none of these major players you would expect to see. The innovation come from. So how did this fellow do what I like to call sometimes mission impossible, especially at 5:30 on a Friday? So how did he accomplish the mission impossible? Well, one thing he did is he started playing with the elements. So every coking plant has certain elements. For example, you get the coke out, you wash it, you grind, and then you bake. That's the basic procedure. And Shimura at some point said, well, wait a minute, what happens if we do something different? Let's say we grind first and then we wash. And of course, in correspondence with the suppliers of equipment, which is in part Belgium, coke ovens are Belgium, the grinders are from England. They say, but no, you can't do that. You have to stick to the design we sent you with the equipment. You have to install it in that particular way, because of course it's logical that you wash first and then you grind, because you really don't want to wash sand. You want to wash big pieces, so it goes quicker. You need less water, less labor, and then you would grind. And of course, Shimura was not a stupid man. He understood what it meant to wash after grinding, so basically washing sand or washing pebbles. But he said, well, wait a minute, if Japanese coal is impure as it is, maybe grinding it first would break the composition of coal, and maybe maybe washing it would help rinse a bit of impurities and get a little bit of a pure coal out of it. And then he passed it into the oven. So that was one thing he did. And it worked. It worked in part because, as he predicted, it did manage to get rid of it. It mechanically got rid of a little bit of impurities from the coal, enough for him to get a good result. Another thing that he did is he said, well, what happens if really repetition is the mother of all success, and if we do it again? So he would take something he called X-coal, which is the coal he got after the first baking. He would add a bit of Japanese coal to it, and he would rebake it. So kind of like a gratin. And he would manage to get something really, really interesting, which is a coke of the same grade as if it were made from anthracite. Now, what is the problem with that? The problem with that is that, of course, if you use a lot of water that you need to wash coal after having ground it, you have a major environmental problem, because all this water is discharged into the Yodogawa. So that's one aspect that's highly problematic. Another aspect is cost, and this is the point where I'm trying to establish right now whether it's economically practical, whether it's in terms of money. Does it cost you more to import Cardiff coke and to bake it in Japan in a Belgian coke oven, or is it the same? Is it better? What does it make? And in my assumption is, and I will stand corrected if it turns out to be differently, is that in the beginning it was actually much more expensive to get the same quantities of coke from using Shimomura's method. The reason why we know, by the way, that it worked is because it was patented both in Japan and the United States. So we know the technique worked to obtain it. So you could possibly obtain it. Whether it made economic sense or not is different. The interesting part of it is, of course, is that there was a political will under the major imperatives, which were self-reliance. There was a political will to try and make this work. And this is why after this has been patented and after Russo-Japanese War in 1905, Shimomura is commissioned by the military to go and build these the same battery ovens in Yawata Seitatsu, which is today's Nippon Steel company, which is another reason why we know it definitely worked for a while. But again, the question is, was it a measure of making sure that in case we pick a fight with British and our alliance goes to hell, and someone tries a naval blockade, we will actually be able to produce all the coke and coal that we need locally? Or is it just, or was it really something that was economically viable in the long run? And these are the questions of that I would like to explore further. But for that, to go first to Japan, check the prices. One last point on the circulation. When you look at the correspondence with the British engineers, who are some of the Belgian ones as well, they're very picky. They really don't understand why this obstinate Japanese engineer really wants to do things differently. Because for them, it really doesn't matter. For him, it does. It's really important that he can take a local ingredient and make something that otherwise they would have to import. Another thing that makes them really irritated is once that the coking plant is installed, he starts making suggestions. To Belgian headquarters, telling them, you see, you could do things a little bit different. This would improve the durability of the equipment you're sending me, right? And this is an interesting point, because I don't really know whether and to what extent the suggestions he was making over the long run were taken seriously, and to what extent they may have ended up in the design of some of the equipment that was being sold further. But I do know that he tried to make that contribution, and he was telling them, well, with the elevators, for example, that bring coal to the grinding, if you exchange certain parts of it, it's going to last much longer than a year, because the equipment you have sent us lasts a year, and that's really not practical. We cannot be ordering new elevators every year from Sheffield. And this is another, this is an aspect of circularity that I would like to explore further in this work. And I think I want to leave a bit of time for questions and answers, so I'll stop here, and I look forward to. And if you run for lunch, for dinner, that's okay. I won't hold it against you. Thank you very much.
I've got 3 questions. The first one is a very technical question. If you wash first or wash second, is there not a very big difference in terms of how long your greening equipment is going to endure the treatment? Because if you green after washing, before washing, it means that you're going to get sand on the metal parts, and that's very bad for greening. Second question is, well, I'm not sure actually it's so exceptional. When you look at the Jevons report in 1867, I think, you can see that there's a very large concern going on in Europe then, and which developed with the development of oil energy, about a secure provision of energy in kind of in time of war. And there were 2 main solutions tested, to my knowledge. The first one was to create specific stocks or specific ways to create energy in case of war. For example, it was just perhaps designed in terms of capacity for war. And the second way was to create special financial venues so as to finance a kind of strategic stock. So I was wondering whether there was some kind of financial duty or regulatory innovation in Japan at the same time, so as to secure a stock of coke. And so those are my 2 last questions. Thank you.
Alekxandra is not an economic historian. So Alekxandra doesn't know about financial tools that were put into place, but Alekxandra does know that Japan had a huge stockpile just before the Russo-Japanese War. 1902, there was an alliance with England. Part of that alliance was making sure that Japan has enough of good quality coal. But that's not the same as being able to take coal from Kyushu, which was good for nothing in terms of steel industry, and make coke out of it. So, and this is and military is a very interesting case because this technology is available in 1902 at least, and Japan is going into war, probably knowing that this exists, right? But none of this was ever brought into military use until 1905. And this is after the Russo-Japanese War. At the same time, when Japan is switching to petrol. So 1905 is where Japan switches to oil, navally. And it's the same time that telegraphy is introduced. Because one of my first arguments why is this important for military is because, of course, when you have commercial ships, it doesn't really matter if you use coal, which produces prodigious amounts of smoke. It doesn't really matter. Smoke is fine. But smoke is not fine in battle when you have close formations of 12 ships, and then you have to signal between. It turned out I was wrong because Battle of Tsushima was the first time Japanese used the radio connection between ships and to the coast. So that was not, and I have to say I was very disappointed that my research topic didn't have a strong military connection, if for no other reason, because the archives are better, and it's easier to explore. But that was not the. But you are right that everyone worries about supplies, but there's supplies and supplies. So it's not just making sure we have enough coal, but how we got there. So it's a little bit. It runs a little bit deeper as a problematic. Yes.
With the shift to petrol in 1905, I think there's a very good reason for that.
Oh yeah.
And it's a new generation of battleships. It's the dreadnought, which they also get from Great Britain. I think that's the reason why they shift to petrol. I think that's the only one.
Oh yeah, it's a very good reason. I'm just saying that I was very disappointed that it wasn't my technology.
Oh, of course.
That was very important for.
But then, with regard to your question about price, I think it's very hard, if not impossible, to answer now. Well, of course, if you look at the prices, there are cases in economic history, Nazi Germany, for instance, where there is a drive for self-sufficiency, which basically made things very, very expensive. And I wouldn't be surprised that it would be the case in Japan as well. But there definitely was a political will, which was stronger than just the economic price. I think that's.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think again, I cannot make this case in numbers right now, but when you think logically about the process, you would say, well, how does this make sense? And I'm sure that in the first years it doesn't. I mean, Shimomura is not the only. Shimomura is the first one to patent this process, but he's not the first one to. He's not the only one to work with these ovens. These ovens have been perfected further, and I suspect that as they got perfected, and as they got a better grip on it,
they got more efficient.
It got more efficient because Osaka Gas was the first byproduct coking plant in Japan, but it was by far not the last one. Very quickly, you had 7 or 8 of them within 10 years, and on a much larger scale because we're talking about military. As well as in Tokyo plant. But an interesting consequence of that, technologically speaking, not economically, is that Osaka got to be one of the first Japanese cities to be gasified because there was all this gas.
Of course.
That needed to be put somewhere, right? Yeah. The negative consequences of that is that you had about 50 tons of coal tar, per day that you didn't know what to do because at that time you really didn't not necessarily know what to do with coal tar. And one of the sad things about that is that you see there is a reason why we don't have a portrait here, and that is that in a drive to figure out how to use coal tar at the eve of the First World War, when we knew that the Germans are going to cut supplies, especially for tar and for dyes by consequence, there's a major explosion because he's trying to make an experiment from memory. There's a major explosion in his lab. He loses his eyesight. And which is a whole different story about accidents in labs and accidents in mines, but I'm not going into
that. One of the main reasons why Italy goes into World War I in 1915 is that they realized that if they stay as a neutral country, Great Britain would not allow them to import any kind of coal. So the whole economy goes completely to stop So even, I mean, if I think that for a country that has an imperial ambition so strong as we saw before from the figures of the military spending, I think this really makes a huge incentive to go and research. And also because if I understand correctly, oil doesn't solve the problem because you don't have oil.
No,
Do you in
course
Japan?
not.
So I mean, at least you have
Yeah.
some coal. So
Yeah.
if you manage to find a way to use the coal you have on your own territory, I mean, this, from a point of view of demand, I mean, you have a huge incentive to go into this kind of things.
I mean, and interesting. Speaking about the empire, one of the interesting consequences of this technology is that there was no argument for direct link, but I'm sure that there must be something behind the fact that just at the point when this technology becomes available, all of a sudden you have a scramble of Japanese companies for two things. One is Hokkaido coal, and two is mining concessions in Manchuria. Because the coal mined in Manchuria is the same type of bituminous coal that we have in Japan. Now, most of the coal that was extracted in Manchuria was the coal used for the Manchurian Railroad, and in this case, doesn't really matter what kind of coal you have. But a lot of it was also, or a significant portion of it, was available to go to the steel industry. Whether in the end it did or didn't, this is a different question. But this possibility that all of a sudden this vast coal deposit, and China does have the world's largest coal deposit, all of a sudden is useful in so many more ways than it was previously, just because someone figured out how to bake coke, how to bake coal differently.